The sea is flat and black, broken only by a thin line of moonlight trembling across the Pacific. Inside the submarine, the air is stale and metallic. Sweat clings to wool uniforms. Condensation drips from cold steel pipes. A stopwatch ticks softly in the control room. Moments ago, the attack should have been over. 14 Japanese ships had filled the periscope lens, dark silhouettes cutting through the water in disciplined columns. Torpedoes had been fired cleanly, spreads calculated with care, and yet, one by one, the enemy had turned away. White wakes curved sharply. Steel hulls slipped through gaps that should not have existed. Now the sea above is alive. Propellers churn harder. Sonar pulses echo through the hull like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. The enemy believes the danger has passed. They are already preparing to hunt. Deep inside the submarine, a different clock is running. Empty torpedo tubes must be reloaded. Men move in silence, muscles burning, hands slick with oil and sweat. 8 minutes. That is all the time they have. What follows will not be a chase. It will be a reversal, born in darkness, pressure, and absolute precision. And it begins long before this night ever arrived. By the time this submarine slipped beneath the surface, the Pacific War had already become a contest of endurance rather than spectacle. The great carrier battles captured headlines, but far from those clashes, the outcome of the war depended on something quieter and more merciless: logistics. Japan was an island empire stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean. Every factory, every airfield, every garrison depended on ships that had to cross exposed sea lanes day after day. By late 1942 and into 1943, that vulnerability was no longer theoretical. American submarines, once an afterthought in pre-war planning, were being pushed to the front line. Their mission was simple in language and brutal in practice: cut the arteries of the Japanese war economy, sink the cargo ships, sink the tankers, force the empire to starve its own armies. Yet, this mission had begun badly. Early in the war, U.S. submariners faced an enemy they did not fully understand and weapons they could not fully trust. The Mark 14 torpedo, the primary submarine-launched weapon, suffered from deep running errors, faulty magnetic exploders, and contact pistols that failed on impact. Crews watched perfect attack solutions dissolve into harmless wakes. Morale suffered quietly, one missed opportunity at a time. Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy adapted quickly. Convoys became tighter, escorts multiplied. Destroyers and smaller escort vessels were equipped with sonar, depth charges, and disciplined procedures refined through bitter experience. Japanese commanders learned to assume submarines were present even when no torpedo hit. An evaded attack was not a victory for the attacker. It was often a death sentence. Submarines operated alone, days or weeks from friendly support. Once detected, there was no cavalry coming. The steel hull, barely thicker than a man's arm in places, was all that stood between the crew and crushing pressure. Depth charges did not need to hit directly. They only needed to be close enough to deform metal, rupture seals, or shake machinery loose. Despite this, American submarine doctrine was evolving. Crews drilled relentlessly on torpedo handling, damage control, and silent running. Commanders learned patience, waiting for the highest value targets, accepting long periods of tension followed by seconds of action. Reloading torpedo tubes, once considered a post-attack task, was increasingly treated as part of the battle itself. Japanese shipping losses began to rise steadily. Each sinking forced longer routes, heavier escorts, and more fuel burn just to move fuel. Still, Japanese convoy commanders believed in their countermeasures. Many had survived attacks already. They trusted speed, maneuvering, and aggressive pursuit. If torpedoes missed, the submarine must be close, and a close submarine could be destroyed. This belief shaped encounters at sea. An evaded spread was often followed immediately by an offensive response. Escorts surged toward the estimated firing position. Sonar operators searched for the faintest return. Depth charges were rolled off stern racks in patterns designed to bracket and crush. Time was measured not in minutes, but in seconds between explosions. Inside American submarines, the reality was claustrophobic and unforgiving. Torpedoes weighed over a ton. Reloading them required coordinated effort from multiple men. muscle power alone moving steel cylinders through narrow passages on rollers and chain hoists. Every clang had to be muted, every shouted command suppressed. Silence was survival. Commanders knew that a second attack, if attempted at all, had to be fast. The enemy would not wait. 8 minutes could be an eternity, or a miracle. All of this, the technical flaws, the tactical lessons, the quiet war against supply lines, was pressing down on this one patrol. Because when the Torpedoes missed that night, it was not just an attack that had failed. It was a test of whether the submarine force had truly learned how to turn failure into opportunity. And as the convoy began to believe it was safe, the conditions were set for a decision that would define the next few minutes beneath the sea. The patrol itself had begun, without ceremony, another name added to a sailing board, another boat slipping past the breakwater at dusk. The submarine carried fuel, food, and torpedoes meant to last weeks, but no one aboard believed in routine anymore. Every patrol into Japanese-controlled waters felt narrower than the last. The enemy's perimeter had hardened. Air patrols were more frequent. Convoys were no longer scattered stragglers, but organized systems, built around mutual defense. The waters this submarine entered were critical. They lay astride routes carrying oil from the southern resource areas to the Japanese home islands. Tankers, freighters, troop transports, all passed through these lanes. Losing them did not just inconvenience Japan, it eroded the ability to fight at all. For that reason, these routes were guarded carefully. Escorts rotated constantly. Older destroyers, fast and aggressive, worked alongside smaller escort vessels designed specifically for anti-submarine warfare. Their crews were trained to react instantly, not to wait for confirmation. The commander of this submarine understood that reality intimately. He was not new to war. He had watched torpedoes fail before. He had listened to depth charges roll closer with each pattern. His confidence was not theatrical. It was built from repetition, attack after attack, where restraint mattered more than bravado. He trusted his crew because he had drilled them until movements became instinct. Inside the boat, the men knew their stations without discussion. Torpedo men practiced reloading in darkness, hands finding latches and guides by feel alone. Fire control teams recalculated solutions under pressure, knowing that a single error in speed or angle could waste everything. The engine room crew learned to live with engines idling at the edge of silence, vibrations dampened, bearings coaxed rather than forced. Japanese escorts relied heavily on momentum. Once they believed an attack had failed, they often surged forward, accelerating, maneuvering aggressively to box in the firing position. But this tactic had a flaw. Speed created noise. Tight turns disrupted formation. Escorts focused on the ghost they thought they knew, not on the possibility that the submarine was still calculating. This was the narrow opening American submarine commanders increasingly sought. Not the first shot, but the second. A mist spread could lure escorts into false confidence. A convoy that resumed course too quickly could expose its flank. Timing mattered more than bravery. On this patrol, that theory would be tested under extreme conditions. The submarine had already maneuvered into position once, threading through screens and overlapping patrol arcs. It would not get a third chance. Battery power was finite. Air was growing foul. Every minute submerged carried risk. When contact was made, it was unmistakable. 14 ships, moving together, protected but heavy with cargo. The kind of target that justified every mile traveled and every danger endured. The first attack was executed cleanly. Torpedoes left the tubes. The crew waited. Then came the disappointment. No detonations. Just wakes. Just evasive turns. The enemy had slipped through. In that moment, the submarine was no longer the hunter it had planned to be. It was prey, unless the crew could turn discipline into speed, and speed into silence. The convoy did not scatter. It did not panic. Instead, it did what Japanese doctrine demanded. It pressed on, confident that the threat had passed or would soon be crushed behind it. And deep below, in the cramped forward compartment, the order was given to reload immediately, because there would not be time later. The men in the forward torpedo room did not talk about fear. There was no space for it, physically or mentally. The compartment was already crowded with machinery, spare parts, and the long steel bodies of torpedoes waiting on racks. When the first attack failed, no one argued or hesitated. They moved because they had practiced this moment hundreds of times, knowing that one day it would arrive without warning. Each torpedo weighed more than a small car. It had to be released from its rack, guided onto rollers, aligned perfectly with the tube, and locked in place. All of this had to be done quietly. A dropped tool or a careless clang against the hull could carry through water like a shout. Sweat ran into eyes, hands slipped, then tightened. Muscles strained against unforgiving metal. 8 minutes was not a guideline. It was the difference between striking again and being hunted down. Above them, the tactical picture was shifting by the second. The fire control team listened intently, marking propeller beats and estimating speeds. Japanese escorts were accelerating, pushing ahead of the convoy's center. That movement suggested confidence. It also suggested separation. The formation was stretching, opening gaps that had not existed moments before. This was where doctrine met instinct. The first attack had revealed how alert the enemy was. The second would rely on exploiting what they assumed next. Japanese commanders often believed that submarines, once detected, would immediately go deep and flee. Few expected a boat to stay close, reload under threat, and strike again so quickly. Doing so required nerve, but more importantly, coordination. Leadership in this moment was not loud or dramatic. Orders were short, movements were deliberate. The commander trusted his men to execute without supervision because hovering would only slow them down. He focused instead on positioning, adjusting depth, angle, and speed to remain invisible while still staying within firing range. From the enemy's perspective, the situation looked under control. No explosions had followed the initial torpedo wakes. The convoy had maneuvered successfully. Escorts were already preparing to sweep the estimated firing area. In their experience, this was when submarines died. But underwater warfare punished assumptions. Sound bent unpredictably. Water layers distorted sonar returns. A submarine that did not panic could vanish into blind spots created by the enemy's own movement. Every knot of speed the escorts added made them louder, easier to track, and less precise. Morally, the pressure was absolute. A second attack meant accepting that escape would come later, or not at all. If the torpedoes hit, the escorts would respond violently. If they missed again, there would be no ambiguity left. Depth charges would follow, relentlessly. Yet within the steel hull, resolve hardened rather than cracked. This was the reason these men had volunteered. Not for certainty, but for moments when training, trust, and timing had to align perfectly. The final torpedo slid into place. The tube door was secured. Somewhere forward, a quiet acknowledgement was passed down the line. And with the reload complete, the submarine eased into position once more, while above them, the convoy sailed on, unaware that the danger it believed escaped was about to return. Technology, in this moment, was not about innovation. It was about limits. The submarine was operating near the edge of what its machinery and crew could sustain. Batteries drained steadily with every correction in depth and heading. Air grew thicker with carbon dioxide. The hull, though intact, groaned softly as pressure shifted. Nothing was failing, but nothing could be wasted. The reload itself was a triumph of design and discipline. American submarines were built with reload capability in mind, but speed depended entirely on the crew. There were no powered loaders, no automation. Chains, pulleys, rollers, and human strength did all the work. Every man knew exactly where to stand and when to move. One mistake could jam a torpedo halfway into the tube, turning the compartment into a steel trap. Leadership in this phase was invisible but decisive. The commander did not rush the attack. He waited until the geometry made sense again. Japanese ships had altered course after the first spread, but they were settling back into formation. Slightly looser, slightly less vigilant. Escorts were forward, focused on the wrong patch of water. The convoy's center was briefly exposed. This was not bravado. It was calculation under extreme compression. The firing solution had to account for speed changes, zigzag patterns, and the lingering possibility that torpedoes might still malfunction. The commander adjusted angles to maximize impact probability, even if that meant delaying seconds longer than instinct wanted. On the enemy side, confidence was becoming complacency. The lack of explosions reinforced a belief that their evasive maneuvers had worked. Escorts began to widen their search arcs. Some ships increased speed to make up lost time. In doing so, they unknowingly disrupted their own protection. There was also a moral weight that settled over the control room. These were not abstract targets. Each silhouette represented hundreds of men, supplies meant to sustain armies, fuel meant to keep aircraft flying. The submarine's mission demanded destruction, but it also demanded responsibility. Every torpedo fired had to matter. Silence deepened, engines slowed to bare minimum. Sonar pings faded slightly as distance and angle shifted. The submarine held its breath. In warfare beneath the sea, success often belonged not to the boldest, but to the most patient. And as the convoy continued forward, convinced it had survived the worst, patience was about to be rewarded with violence. The firing position came together quietly, almost gently. The submarine adjusted depth by a few feet, trimming itself level. The periscope rose just long enough to confirm shapes and angles, then slipped back down. Nothing dramatic, no shouted commands. Just numbers passing between men who had already internalized what those numbers meant. The convoy was closer now. The ship's outlines overlapped in the plotting room. Their courses, once defensive and erratic, had stabilized. Several escorts were well ahead of the main body, racing toward where they believed the submarine had been minutes earlier. The gap behind them widened. In the control room, the clock mattered again, but differently. Not as a countdown to destruction, but as a measure of alignment, speed, bearing, angle on the bow. The commander waited until uncertainty narrowed to its smallest possible margin. He knew this might be the last chance before depth charges erased all options. Fire! Compressed air hissed. The first torpedo left the tube cleanly, its gyroscope stabilizing almost immediately. Seconds later, another followed, then another. A full spread, aimed not at one ship, but at the convoy's rhythm. Timed so evasive action by one would carry it into the path of another. Inside the submarine, there was no celebration, only listening. The men counted silently, knowing roughly how long the run would take. Every second stretched. Above them, the sea remained deceptively calm. The first explosion came as a distant, muffled thud. Then another. Closer, heavier. The hull vibrated, not from enemy weapons, but from shockwaves transmitted through water. A third detonation followed, then a fourth, overlapping in rapid succession. The convoy erupted into chaos. Ships began to shear away from their tracks, some colliding, others slowing abruptly as damage took hold. At least one vessel lost power almost immediately, its silhouette disappearing as fire and smoke replaced its outline. Another took a hit amidships, breaking formation and bleeding speed. The careful geometry that had protected the convoy minutes earlier disintegrated. For the escorts, the situation flipped instantly. Confidence vanished. There was no longer a single firing position to hunt, only evidence that the submarine had never left. Orders were shouted across bridges, rudders spun. Depth charges were readied in haste rather than sequence. Inside the submarine, the commander did not linger. He ordered a turn away from the attack course, beginning the slow, deliberate descent that might save them. The crew braced for retaliation, knowing it would come hard and fast. Above, the Japanese ships burned and slowed, some already settling lower in the water. What had been a protected column was now a cluster of wounded targets, and the escorts, pulled forward by assumption, were suddenly out of position. The second attack had not just hit ships, it had broken the enemy's understanding of what was happening beneath them. The counterattack arrived almost immediately, but it came disorganized. Depth charges rolled into the sea in uneven patterns, detonations spaced too far apart, some too shallow, others too deep. The ocean convulsed around the submarine, but the blows lacked the precision that kills. Plates rattled, light bulbs shattered, a gauge needle jumped, then steadied. The hull held. The commander took the boat deeper, angling slightly off course to exploit the confusion above. Sound became a weapon now. The escorts were loud, engines racing, propellers cavitating as they turned sharply. Sonar operators struggled to separate echoes from wreckage, bubbles, and burning debris. Each explosion created false returns, masking the submarine's true position. Inside, the crew went still. Not frozen, controlled. Damage control teams checked seals and valves by touch. Electrical systems were rerouted quietly. No one spoke unless necessary. Every man understood that survival now depended on becoming indistinguishable from the sea itself. Above, the convoy was no longer a convoy. One ship had broken apart, its stern sagging as flames climbed higher. Another slowed drastically, listing as water flooded compartments. Smaller vessels struggled to maneuver around the wreckage. Signals flashed between bridges, but cohesion was gone. The escorts, meant to protect, were forced into rescue, coordination, and damage assessment. Minutes passed, then more. Depth charge patterns drifted away from the submarine's actual track. The enemy was chasing certainty where there was none. Eventually, the ocean quieted. Engines faded into distance. Sonar pings weakened, then disappeared entirely. The submarine leveled off at depth, its crew waiting long after instincts suggested it was safe. When the commander finally allowed the boat to rise and move away, it did so slowly, cautiously, as if the sea itself might betray them. Only when hours had passed without pursuit did the tension ease enough for men to breathe fully again. What remained behind them was devastation that would take days to fully confirm. Multiple Japanese ships were lost. Others were crippled beyond repair. Supplies meant for distant fronts would never arrive. Crews who had believed themselves safe moments earlier were gone. Inside the submarine, there was no cheering, no dramatic release, just exhaustion, quiet acknowledgement, and the knowledge that something rare had been accomplished. A failed attack had been turned into a decisive blow, not through luck, but through discipline under pressure. And as the boat slipped back into the darkness of open water, the consequences of that night began spreading far beyond the fading sounds of battle. Confirmation did not come immediately. Submarine warfare rarely allowed certainty in the moment. Explosions heard through water could deceive. Fires seen through a periscope could mask damage or exaggerate it. The commander recorded positions, estimated tonnage, and times, knowing that only later, through intercepted reports, post-war records, or the absence of ships that should have arrived, would the truth fully emerge. What was clear, even before confirmation, was that the convoy had been shattered. At least several ships were unquestionably hit. One had broken apart. Others had slowed enough to become liabilities rather than assets. Escorts that should have been screening the perimeter were forced into rescue and coordination, their original mission compromised. Even ships that survived the night would arrive late, damaged or diverted. Each outcome a strategic failure in a war measured by supply flow. Inside the submarine, the immediate aftermath was procedural. Damage reports were filed. Systems were checked again. Torpedo inventory was updated with careful notation of what remained and what had been expended. The air was scrubbed. Batteries were conserved. Men ate when they could, though few had appetite. Adrenaline does not vanish quickly. It lingers, leaving fatigue in its wake. Radio silence was maintained. There would be no celebratory message, no immediate acknowledgement. The submarine still had to survive the patrol. Enemy air coverage increased with daylight. Additional escorts could arrive. The sea that had protected them in darkness could betray them in hours. For the Japanese side, the impact was immediate and unsettling. Convoys were designed to project control. Their failure eroded confidence not only in escort tactics, but in assumptions about submarine behavior. Reports filtered upward describing a submarine that did not disengage, that reloaded and struck again with speed few believed possible. These accounts challenged existing doctrine. Strategically, the loss or even serious damage of multiple ships in a single engagement carried weight beyond tonnage. It meant fuel burned without return. It meant schedules disrupted across entire routes. It meant more escorts assigned to fewer ships, stretching resources thinner with every adjustment. The sea lanes became quieter, not safer. Within Allied command structures, encounters like this began to stand out. They demonstrated that submarines were no longer just ambushers of opportunity, but adaptive hunters capable of sustained engagement. Training emphasized rapid reloads. Commanders were encouraged to think beyond the first attack, to consider how enemy reactions could be exploited, rather than merely survived. The crew themselves carried the aftermath inward. They would not speak openly about the night for some time. Shared glances replaced words. Everyone aboard understood how close failure had come, and how narrow the margin between destruction and success truly was. The patrol continued, because it always did. The submarine moved on to new waters, new contacts, new risks. But the echo of that engagement lingered. shaping decisions and expectations long after the sea had closed over the wreckage left behind. In the weeks that followed, patterns began to emerge. Ships expected in port did not arrive. Convoy schedules slipped, then fractured. Japanese records, examined long after the war, would confirm that multiple vessels from that formation were lost or rendered unusable. Cargo meant to sustain distant garrisons vanished into the Pacific, along with trained crews that could not be easily replaced. The psychological effect was harder to measure, but no less real. Convoy commanders grew more cautious, sometimes excessively so. Routes were altered, speeds reduced to maintain tighter formations. Escorts were pulled from other duties, thinning protection elsewhere. Each adjustment carried its own cost. Every ship saved through caution meant another exposed somewhere else. For the submarine force, engagements like this validated years of painful learning. Early failures, missed torpedoes, faulty detonators, lost boats, had forced adaptation under fire. By this stage of the war, those lessons were converging. Torpedo reliability was improving. Crews were better trained. Commanders were more willing to stay in the fight after an initial setback. This did not make submarine warfare safer. Casualty rates remained high. A single mistake, a single lucky depth charge, could still end everything. But it made success more deliberate, less dependent on chance. Recognition, when it came, was restrained. Submarine crews did not receive public acclaim while the war raged on. Reports were classified. Achievements were tallied quietly. Decorations, if awarded, often arrived long after the patrol had ended, or long after the war itself. What mattered more to those involved was proof. Proof that discipline could overcome fear, that speed under pressure could outweigh enemy numbers, that even when an attack failed, it did not have to end the fight. For Japan, the cumulative effect was devastating. Submarines like this one did not win the war alone, but they hollowed out the ability to wage it. By late 1944, fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Factories slowed. Ships stayed in harbor because there was nothing to carry, or no fuel to move them. This single night at sea did not decide the Pacific War, but it belonged to a pattern that did. A pattern in which control of the ocean shifted not through dramatic fleet battles alone, but through relentless pressure applied by unseen adversaries, strike by strike. As the war moved toward its conclusion, moments like this faded into statistics, charts, and post-war analyses. Yet for those who had been there, inside a steel hull in the dark, the memory never became abstract. And it is in that quiet space between numbers and experience that the true meaning of this encounter rests. Long after the war ended, historians would measure victory in charts and tonnage tables. They would count ships sunk, routes severed, fuel denied. Those numbers matter. They explain outcomes, but they cannot fully capture what submarine warfare demanded from the people who fought it. This encounter stands not because it was unique, but because it was representative. It revealed how modern war at sea had shifted beneath the surface, into spaces where visibility was measured in seconds and survival depended on restraint as much as aggression. It showed that failure, when met with discipline rather than panic, could become a weapon in itself. The submarine did not win by surprise alone. It won by preparation, by men who had learned to work silently under crushing pressure, to trust systems that could not be seen, and to follow leadership that asked for patience when instinct demanded escape. 8 minutes of reloading mattered because years of training made those minutes possible. For the enemy, the lesson was unsettling. Control of the sea could no longer be asserted simply by numbers or confidence. A single unseen opponent, willing to remain engaged after being detected, could unravel even a well-protected force. The ocean, once a barrier, had become an avenue of vulnerability. For history, this moment fits into a larger truth. Wars are not decided only by grand strategies or famous battles. They are shaped by countless decisions made in confined spaces, under conditions where there is no applause and no certainty of survival. When the submarine slipped away that night, it left behind wreckage that would be cataloged and studied. But more enduring was the proof it carried forward. That resolve, applied precisely and calmly, could bend the course of events even in the darkest depths of war. And in that silence, far below the surface, the nature of naval warfare had quietly, permanently changed.